Recognize these men? Of course you do. Every red-blooded American from preschool to old school has grown up seeing these iconic faces plastered everywhere and hearing about their wondrous, patriotic deeds. They're among America's foremost founding fathers. Benjamin Franklin was a renowned diplomat, dilettante, philosopher, scientist, and inventor. He was the elder statesman of our infant nation and is often referred to as the first American. Thomas Jefferson was an inventor and a Renaissance man, possessing talents perhaps exceeding even those of Franklin's. He was our third president and the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. George Washington, the most revered of all, reflected the face of America during wartime. He was our first national hero and our first president. He's often referred to as the father of our country. A little-known commonality between these men was their association, discourse, and friendship with this man. Do you recognize him? He, too, was a founding father. He was one of the 5 delegates from the state of New Jersey to sign the Declaration of Independence. He was also the state's first Speaker of the new General Assembly, a position of power second only to the governor. Like many luminaries of his time, he distinguished himself in multiple disciplines. He was a farmer, judge, legislator, and a helmsman in the revolutionary fervor sweeping through the colonies. His name is John Hart, and during his lifetime he was well acquainted with the other 3 illustrious men whose pictures are ubiquitous today. These 4 men were contemporaries and compatriots in the founding of our nation. Fate and circumstances drew this self-made man into similar political circles where they became friends, trusted allies, and co-conspirators against the crown. But unlike so many of his associates, John Hart has largely been forgotten by history. These various images of Hart have come to be accepted as authentic likenesses of the unsung patriot. Do you recognize him now? Don't feel so badly. Neither would John Hart if he were alive today. These representations are very likely not accurate likenesses at all. The histories of these images have become shrouded in as much mystery as the life of the man they pretend to portray. Early in his political career as a member of the New Jersey Provincial General Assembly, Hart worked closely with Benjamin Franklin's bastard son, William Franklin, the last royal governor of New Jersey. Prior to the War of Independence, John Hart became acquainted with Benjamin Franklin through his numerous business dealings. Needing bills of lading for trading on the Delaware River, Hart looked to Franklin, then a successful Philadelphia printer, as the local provider. Years later, Hart would serve alongside Franklin of Pennsylvania and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia in the sweltering Philadelphia summer of 1776 as members of the Second Continental Congress. It would be during the war that followed where he would find occasion to serve General George Washington. Hart earned his place in history as one of the 56 men to pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the cause of liberty. And he took this pledge to heart, going far beyond what could have been expected of any man. So why don't Americans and New Jerseyans, for that matter, celebrate John Hart's birthday? Why aren't there any banks, schools, towns, or turnpike service stations named in his honor? Why, in fact, do most people not even know who he was? Least of all, what he did. The lack of personal correspondence from Hart certainly fuels the mystery of the man. But also, while many of the legendary founders went on to greater national public service in various high-profile posts following the British surrender at Yorktown, John Hart did not survive the war. Closer in age to Benjamin Franklin than to Jefferson and Washington, John Hart was 63 years old when he signed the Declaration of Independence. Far too busy attending to the demands of running a new government for a people and a nation at war to sit for a portrait for posterity to admire. he would live only another 3 years, thereby dooming his deeds to historical obscurity. So it remains that very little is really known about him, and much of what is known is cloaked in myth and shrouded in legend. His childhood is a complete mystery, and that which has been passed down word of mouth about his adult life has often been subject to embellishment and dramatization to suit biographer and reader alike. Indeed, unlike his famous contemporaries, next to nothing has been written about him by the people who actually knew him and worked with him. And even less has come down to us written in his own hand. Only 6 letters he wrote during his lifetime are known to have survived, and none of these represent personal correspondence. This lack of documents written by Hart has led some to assert he was illiterate. Though he was not formally educated and not a man of letters like many of his fellow compatriots, a man of Hart's standing and record of public service was surely not illiterate. Like most New Jersey agrarians, Hart was most likely homeschooled and self-taught. But the numerous legislative bills he authored, supported, and signed attest to his understanding of the language of lawyers and the formalities of the written word, as do the many important public positions he held during his lifetime. But still, the mystery persists. Farmer or firebrand? Just who was John Hart? In part, it's because, contrary to accepted belief, it remains doubtful that he is the man pictured in this official portrait that hangs outside the governor's office under the golden Capitol dome of the New Jersey State House. This is because no authenticated likeness of John Hart made during his lifetime or shortly thereafter has ever been found and carefully documented, including this one that did not surface until nearly 100 years after his death in the post-Civil War patriotic zeal leading up to the nation's centennial. However well-intended it may have been at the time, in hindsight it seems to add more insult and injury to the reputation of a man whose courageous life and invaluable contributions to the cause of American freedom have largely been overlooked by historians. Without a picture to guide us, we may have only his legacy from which to paint a complete portrait of this true patriot. So let us lift the veil and peek beyond the canvas. Hart's New World roots can be traced to the year 1636, when his paternal great-grandfather, a 40-year-old shoemaker accompanied by his wife, set out from London aboard the James. They arrived in New England but quickly relocated to Long Island, where their eldest son, a carpenter named John, married Mary Hunt. John Hart and Mary Hunt were the signer's grandparents. Grandfather John amassed considerable landholdings in Long Island before moving to New Jersey. Accounts further suggest that sometime in the early 1700s, all 5 of Grandfather John's sons joined him in a mass migration south to the greener farm pastures of New Jersey. Here they settled along the banks of the fertile Delaware River Valley, nestled just beyond the Sourland Mountains. Based upon Presbyterian church records found in Newtown, Long Island, it appears that one son, Edward, went back to Newtown briefly, where he married Martha Furman on May 17, 1712. The couple then returned to Maidenhead, now Lawrenceville, New Jersey, where all of their children were born. Though the exact date of John Hart's birth was never recorded, it can be surmised that Edward's son, named in honor of the child's then recently deceased grandfather, was born in October or November of 1713. This can be further documented through the baptismal registry found in the old Maidenhead Presbyterian Church, where John Hart, the future signer, is listed as being baptized on December 21st, 1713. Today, most people who think they know something about John Hart are content to imagine him as a gentleman farmer from rural Hopewell, New Jersey, in what was once Hunterdon County, but is now part of Mercer County. His home, with perhaps a small portion of a stone wing dating back close to the original structure, can still be seen today, idyllically situated at 60 Hart Avenue in Hopewell Borough. Although the home has been rebuilt and remodeled by subsequent owners, the majestic sweep of the property surrounding the main house harkens back to Hart's time, including an oft-repaired rustic old barn and the lazy, flowing pond that legend has it refreshed Washington's horses and troops bivouacked there before the Battle of Monmouth. A dedication plaque placed on the front lawn and partially hidden by overgrown shrubbery identifies the historic location. Characterized as being handsome in his youth, at age 26, John Hart was already the prominent son of a well-established Hopewell family when in 1739 he married the 18-year-old Deborah Scudder. A gal of considerable means, it was said she had respectable connections, having been raised from about age 10 by her paternal grandfather, Richard Betts Scudder. Scudder was a distinguished landowner and a neighbor of the Harts who was also part of the Long Island migration. His vast estate was situated on a bluff which once overlooked the Delaware River. Together, the blessed union of John Hart and Deborah Scudder would produce a rich and wholesome family of 12 children, consisting equally of 6 boys and 6 girls. Much to the couple's lasting heartache, a 13th child, an unnamed girl, died in childbirth in 1761. This was recorded by John Hart's own hand in the preface of his Bible just as his political career as a legislator was beginning to take off. At the time of his wedding, John Hart had some 193 acres under plow, often referred to as his homestead plantation. In time, John Hart would become the largest landowner in Hopewell, owning in excess of 600 acres, also making him the municipality's largest taxpayer. That made him a natural for election to numerous local offices, including his first in 1750, that of freeholder. He was notably a generous man, donating land from his estate to the local Baptists, where they built the first Baptist meeting house near where the current one still stands. This, despite the fact that he was not of that faith, but was rather what one might call a non-practicing Presbyterian. Such enlightened philanthropy only enhanced his standing in the community and cemented his reputation as a man who put duty and the needs of others before his own. A known racing enthusiast, newspaper accounts taken from the period indicate that Hart bred and stabled many horses on his property as a pastime. Before his life in colonial politics, John Hart served for a time as a justice of the peace in Hunterdon County, a position held 30 years earlier by his father Edward. Justices were responsible for observance of laws, the apprehension and punishment of offenders, the disposition of petty disputes, and various ministerial duties like that of notary. Hart spent many long days in the saddle traveling from place to place in service of his fellow man. John Hart's ever-expanding scope of property and interests brought him into contact with a wide range of acquaintances from all walks of life. To those who knew him, John Hart was a man of the people, who was often called upon by family, friends, and neighbors to witness wills, issue bonds, and co-sign loans. He was a man who lived by his word, a man of impeccable integrity that could be trusted to do what was right, making him an ideal candidate for a career in public service. Of course, it also helped to be known for keeping a cool head, championing family values, and being firmly rooted to the soil. These were but a few of the attributes that set him apart and served him well as he entered the next stage of his career, the political arena. That career began in earnest on March 26, 1761, when at age 48 he became one of 10 newcomers joining the 24-man body sitting in session at Perth Amboy for the start of the 20th New Jersey Provincial General Assembly. Hart was elected as one of 2 members representing his county constituency, which at the time included Hunterdon, Morris, and Sussex. It is perhaps prophetic that the first order of business for that newly elected body was to acknowledge the ascension of King George III to the throne of England, following the death of the former monarch. For the next 10 years, Hart would hold his honorable assemblyman position, serving first a 7-year term from 1761 to 1768, alongside John Reading of Amwell, and then following his re-election in 1769, serving out a 3-year term until 1771, in the 21st General Assembly alongside his friend and occasional rival Samuel Tucker, former High Sheriff of Hunterdon County. During his tenure in the Colonial General Assembly, Hart served on no fewer than 133 committees, chairing 35 of them. The most demanding issues related to provincial fiscal concerns were debated and decided under his careful leadership, including audits, troop levies, funding for public works, and taxation. Coupled with the operations of his farm, racehorses, mill interests, and work as a colonial legislator, John Hart was able to faithfully fulfill all these challenging roles while also attending to his juris duties. He performed all these responsibilities simultaneously, that is, until disagreements with the mother country called him to yet another service, that of a patriot. For many of the colonies, the inexorable march toward independence began in 1765 with impassioned reactions to the English Parliament's proclamation of the Stamp Act. This onerous law imposed revenue stamps on certain American products. Outraged, the Massachusetts colony proposed an intercolonial meeting to organize a common course of action. In response, during their summer session in 1765, the New Jersey General Assembly was not initially of one mind and seemed reluctant to send a delegation. But some members were insistent on asserting the rights of the colonies and supported a stern protest to the Stamp Act. As reported in the Pennsylvania Gazette, John Hart was one of the members pressing for New Jersey to send a delegation to the intercolonial meeting. Ultimately, they did. Although not one of the delegates himself, Hart helped force the swing vote for New Jersey. As events heated up before and after the October meeting in New York, Hart suddenly found himself along with 9 other representatives attending a special meeting at a Burlington tavern on November 26th to draft New Jersey's formal protest as agreed upon by the participants of the Intercolonial Conference. From there, the storm of protests spread with unrelenting speed. Associations known as the Sons of Liberty sprang up everywhere, openly resisting the Stamp Act by the strongest means possible. On March 18, 1766, as John Hart sat among the Hunterdon County Sons of Liberty in Ringo's Tavern, unbeknownst to the group, thousands of miles away across the Big Pond, Parliament had repealed the loathsome Stamp Act. By June, when the royal governor summoned the assembly to give them the good news, John Hart was among the committee of 5 selected to draft the assembly's overture of gratitude to the king for its repeal. By the beginning of March 1772, however, it appeared as though at age 59, John Hart's political career had come to an abrupt and unceremonious end. Having served tirelessly for 10 consecutive years in the General Assembly, Hart suddenly found himself without a seat, suffering his first and only political defeat, losing to his friend and fellow representative Samuel Tucker in a narrowly decided and hotly contested election. Hart took the defeat in stride, returning to his farm and his family while re-immersing himself into his juris duties and his countless business interests. Little did he know this respite from politics would be very brief. With the dumping of 342 chests of East India Company tea into Boston Harbor, allegedly by a band of unruly Indians, in December 1773, the stage was set for Hart's re-entry onto the flaring New Jersey political scene. Within months of the incident, and with resentment fanning throughout the colonies over the inherent unfairness of taxation without representation, John Hart was plucked from retirement and pressed back into public service. On July 8, 1774, in a meeting hurriedly assembled at Ringo's Tavern and chaired by Tucker, without showing any malice towards his former rival, the calm and collected Hart was among those that gathered to draft a resolution setting up a county committee of correspondence similar to ones being organized in the other counties. 2 weeks later, All the county committees of correspondence met in New Brunswick to select the New Jersey delegates who would attend the First Continental Congress, which was scheduled to meet that September in Philadelphia. While neither Hart nor Tucker was chosen as a delegate, they played an integral part in the selection process. As the unsettling year came to a close, a second group of so-called Indians staged another tea party, this time in Greenwich, at the New Jersey shore. Here, a group of 40 New Jersey patriots, posing again as Native Americans, intercepted a load of tea on its way to Philadelphia, setting it on fire. The signal was clear. New Jersey had begun its march down the road to rebellion. Soon, events developing elsewhere throughout the colonies began to outpace decisions being made locally. Thus, the need for a deeper commitment. Individuals with a broader view and an unwavering conviction to redressing the underlying causes of unrest were needed to assume leadership roles in guiding New Jersey through the coming crisis. In January 1775, John Hart was chosen to chair a Hunterdon County Freeholders Committee meeting. The committee immediately approved the recommendation of the First Continental Congress to boycott British goods. It then selected 1,500 representatives led by Hart to attend a meeting in Trenton of the New Jersey Congress set for the last week of May. But before the meeting could happen, from a faraway place came a shot heard round the world. On April 19th, the battles of Lexington and Concord raged. In a hail of musket fire, leaving 49 colonists dead, the war for American independence had begun. Amid the fervor that followed, local militias began to mobilize.
Militia is really misunderstood by a lot of people. I find that as I go around talking about it. And one of the reasons it's misunderstood is because people don't realize that it was a requirement. The New Jersey militia law required every male between the ages of 16 and 50 to sign up for their local militia company.
4 of the Hart boys met the requirement, and 3 served in local militia companies. Jesse, the eldest, became paymaster for the Hunterdon and Somerset County militias. Nathaniel, the next in line, would later see action with the 1st Hunterdon and take a musket ball to the leg that would leave him crippled for the rest of his life. After the fall harvest, 21-year-old Edward signed on, joining up with Joab Houghton, who was temporarily serving as captain in Colonel Joseph Phillips' regiment.
They could be excused if they were physically incapable of doing military duty, or if they were mentally incapable of doing that. And basically the local militia commander made that decision. He knew everybody. He'd grown up with them.
A 4th son, John Jr., much to his father's displeasure, was away trying to make a name and fortune for himself through land speculation down in the Spanish territory of Louisiana, for which he would end up spending time in a Cuban prison cell. On June 23, 1775, with John Hart attending the New Jersey Congress meeting in Trenton, hundreds of cheering Hunterdon County residents lining the roadside in front of the Maidenhead Church caught their first glimpse of the imposing figure of General George Washington as he rode his mount past them on his way to Massachusetts to take command of the Continental Army. With the war for independence now a reality, the citizens of New Jersey would look for leaders to step up from their locally elected officials. By anyone's reckoning, the relationship between John Hart and Samuel Tucker, the 2 emerging Central Jersey superstars spearheading New Jersey's direction during the escalating crisis with the Crown, is a study in contrasts. Although often coming from different philosophies, for a time they appeared to be in accord on most matters related to the needs of their constituents. But ever since winning the General Assembly seat in the heated election of 1772, in which a late surge of non-secular voting groups tipped the scale in Tucker's favor, Tucker seems to have been placed, perhaps by choice, in the dubious position of serving 2 distinctly different constituencies.
Samuel Tucker is a very interesting character to me at this point. He was actively serving in the Colonial Assembly, doing everything a Colonial Assemblyman would do. At the same time, he was also taking leadership positions in the protest movement in a parallel government.
The Loyalists, including most peace-loving Quakers, who clung to the hope that differences with the Crown could be resolved without further bloodshed, and those firebrands sensing the opportunity to take control of their own destiny.
I think both people who became classified as Loyalists and people who became classified as Patriots were interested in freedom. These had a different idea of how to achieve freedom. Obviously, the one group looked at the other group as desiring tyranny because they were supporting the government that they saw as being oppressive and taking away freedoms.
Distanced from the provincial assembly, Hart no longer had any fiduciary obligation to the Loyalists. This included many Church of England voters who were required to swear oaths to the king as both their spiritual leader and their secular sovereign. For Hart, even if it meant skirting the law that he, as a common pleas judge, was appointed to administer, as an otherwise private citizen, he was free to follow his conscience and the counsel of his fellow freeholders who kept electing him to act as their chosen representative. It was, at their urging, that Hart participated in the various unofficial committees of the newly organized legislative body that sprang up operating outside the law. His personal choice in the matter was clear, and his voice became their voice in what constituted a rebel government. Free to follow his own path, Hart rose to the occasion. In October 1775, during the 25-day-long session of the New Jersey Congress meeting in Trenton, Hart became chairman of the committee charged with drafting an ordinance compelling everyone to pay for the expenses of the militia, and together with Abraham Clark, worked on the committee responsible for issuing £30,000 in proclamation money earmarked for the New Jersey defense effort. As the Congress prepared to adjourn, following his designation as one of the members of the New Jersey Committee of Safety, a group separately empowered to act for the public welfare of the colony during the recess of the Congress, Hart sat for the last time as a royally appointed common pleas judge. When the Committee of Safety met again in Princeton on January 10, 1776, John Hart was uncharacteristically absent for the morning session, but arrived at 2:00 p.m. as recorded by Secretary Abraham Clark. Showing further commitment to the cause, he voted in favor of a plan to use the barracks at Trenton to house future Continental troops if deemed necessary. Ironically, this barracks was built nearly 30 years earlier to quarter British troops fighting in the French and Indian War. The New Jersey Congress was summoned to meet in New Brunswick at the end of January following the seizure of the British cargo ship Blue Mountain in Elizabeth by a group of patriots led by the would-be British nobleman Lord Stirling. Congress soon put Hart's experience and reputation as a jurist to work by making him chairman of a newly formed committee to create a Court of the Admiralty, which would help aid the rebel cause. Additionally, realizing the vulnerability of the Eastern Division provincial capital, Perth Amboy, a committee was formed headed by Hart to transfer their treasury and records to New Brunswick. During this same session, the original £30,000 proclamation money for the expanding war effort was increased to $50,000. Hart was immediately appointed as one of the 19 men authorized to sign these New Jersey Continental notes. The list also included newly elected Treasurer Samuel Tucker and Abraham Clark, although Clark never actually ended up endorsing any of the bills. To discourage fraud, each note required 3 signatures to make it acceptable legal tender. John Hart signed all £25,000 sterling of the printed notes. He then passed them along for the next signature. By the spring of 1776, with the words from Thomas Paine's timely treatise, Common Sense, solidifying the rebel cause, a strong case was made for total separation from the mother country. To this end, both Hart and Tucker appeared to stand out among New Jersey men of vision, ready to fully embrace separation from England and lead the fight for independence. By then, Tucker got himself elected president of the New Jersey Provincial Congress. Hart, on the other hand, although elected as vice president, appeared primed and destined to take the leap of faith unto the larger intercontinental stage. It is doubtful the outcome came as much of a surprise to the 56 members of the New Jersey Provincial Congress when they adjourned at the Blue Anchor Tavern in Burlington late in the afternoon of June 22, 1776. Having been in session for 12 days, the mood of the exhausted men was nonetheless exuberant and their direction clear. By a vote of 53-3, a resolution was read empowering 5 delegates, acting separately or as a group, to proceed with all due haste unto Philadelphia, joining with the other colonies in breaking free from the yoke of tyranny and entering into a union for the common defense. The 5 elected by their fellow representatives were all influential men predisposed with great wisdom and a steadfast commitment, having displayed as much before and during the congressional proceedings leading up to this propitious moment. Their qualifications were indisputable. The Reverend John Witherspoon was a Presbyterian minister, a Scotsman by birth. Richard Stockton and Francis Hopkinson were practicing lawyers, former Privy Council members, and Supreme Court judges under the now-defunct Royal Provincial Government. Abraham Clark of Elizabeth knew Hart from their early days together in the New Jersey Provincial Assembly, and more recently from having served together on the Ad Hoc Committee of Safety. Despite the lack of formal education compared to the other delegates, Hart served as the delegation's senior man both in terms of age and as vice president of the New Jersey Congress. He outranked them all, though he was not the oldest delegate to sign the Declaration of Independence. His friend, Benjamin Franklin, at age 70, had him beat by 7 years. Time was tight for the New Jersey delegation. That gave the 5 representatives about a week to return to their homes, call their families together, put their affairs in order, and head off again. But who knew for how long? And what would they find when they came home again? Coming in from Bordentown, just across the Delaware River, Francis Hopkinson is believed to have been the first New Jersey delegate to arrive, presumably around June 28th, at about the same time the British fleet was sighted off Sandy Hook. All 5 delegates presented their credentials and quietly joined in the momentous proceedings. The older trio of Hart, Witherspoon, and Clark roomed together in Philadelphia in very agreeable accommodations, despite the deplorable summer heat. Upon meeting the New Jersey delegation for the first time, John Adams remarked, "They appeared plump for liberty," meaning they were ripe for casting their ballots in favor of independence. It was also at this time that Hart was introduced to Dr. Benjamin Rush, a medical practitioner and member of the Pennsylvania delegation along with Franklin, who, as it so happened, was also Richard Stockton's son-in-law. Upon meeting Hart for the first time, Rush jotted down in his journal his quick impressions of the senior New Jersey delegate. In the absence of any other first-hand biographical information regarding John Hart, this presumably fair but often misconstrued characterization has become canon. As described by Rush, Hart was a plain, honest, well-meaning Jersey farmer with little education, but with good sense and virtue enough to discover and pursue the true interests of his country. According to the later recollections of John Adams, when the New Jersey delegates presented themselves on Monday, July 1st, 1776, Adams gave them a rousing summation regarding the arguments for independence, to which apparently no one added comment or asked for further clarification. Whereupon, Adams noted, they all immediately signed the resolution of secrecy favoring independence. Nothing more has been found in the public records regarding the New Jersey delegation's contribution to these historic proceedings. Any further discourse from these men was likely unnecessary, especially given their decisive marching orders. Their support of independence seems to have been a foregone conclusion. During this time, a committee consisting of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and 2 others were instructed to prepare the declaration for final vote before the entire body. The debate over particulars of the document continued for days until the evening of July 4th when, according to Thomas Jefferson, the declaration was reported by the committee, agreed to by the House, and signed by every member present. The electrifying news spread quickly throughout the colonies. Couriers on horseback carried copies of the document from one capital to another. One of the first reported public readings of the Declaration of Independence was in Trenton on July 8, 1776. There, Samuel Tucker, acting in his capacity as president of the New Jersey Congress, stood atop the Hunterdon County Courthouse steps and read it aloud to an enthusiastic crowd. On August 2, 1776, the New Jersey delegates reunited for the formal document signing ceremony. But by now the game had changed. The tone was more serious. British forces had landed on Staten Island. General Washington's Continental troops were under constant fire. Although there was still important business to be done, the New Jersey delegation did not wish to tarry too long in Philadelphia. During the business of the Continental Congress, the New Jersey Congress remained in session back in Trenton. Through the months of July and August, Hart traveled back and forth doing double duty for both bodies as time permitted. Although he remained a member of the New Jersey Congress out of necessity, James Covenhoven replaced him as vice president. In his absence, a new state constitution for New Jersey had been drawn up, but there was still a place for John Hart in the new state government should he want it. Certainly the people of New Jersey still wanted him. When the new state legislature held its first meeting in Princeton on August 27th, John Hart was chosen to be the first Speaker of the new state of New Jersey General Assembly. The functions and responsibilities of the Speaker have its roots in medieval England. The Speaker's role embodied centuries of sensitive relations between the Crown and the House of Commons. The members' right to address the sovereign was through their chosen Speaker. His position was viewed as a fundamental privilege. It's easy to see why the fledgling New Jersey state legislature made the choice they did in selecting John Hart as the man to shepherd the assembly through the transition from colony to statehood during the turbulent times that lay ahead. One of the peculiar ironies of fate, which is often just a person being in the right place at the right time, is that if John Hart is remembered at all, it's for the single act of putting his name on the most famous document in American history, if not world history. It assured him and all 56 signers a revered place in the hallowed halls of history, veritable immortality, as long as the war ended in an American victory. If this revolution failed, they would be condemned as traitors and most likely executed.
When we talk about the signers of the Declaration, if we take this group of men in that one moment in 1776, they're quite a disparate group. They're all very prominent men from their own colonies. Some are way more prominent than others, but they're all very important people. They have a following, or they wouldn't have been elected to the First and or Second Continental Congress. They have some very different views on some very important subjects. The one thing that starts to unite them at that time is during the First Continental Congress, independence was not the aim of most of them. But by the late spring of 1776, the Second Continental Congress, the idea that independence is now perhaps the only way to go is becoming more and more widespread. It's taking hold really sharply. Too much blood has been spilled. The genie is out of the bottle. They're already, in a sense, pretty much marked men for being, even in that Congress. And when we see who these men are, there's only a very small number of them that are going to become the real icons. But a lot of the other men are known more in their home states than they are nationally. That doesn't belittle the sacrifices they made, in some cases even more than the icons made. When you think that all of those men were now, in a sense, stepping over the line together, and they were conscious of stepping over that line, and even are quoted at that time of saying that they were taking that step, they were now all marked men by the action they had taken.
With the war drawing nearer to their doorstep, the New Jersey State Legislature remained in continuous session at Nassau Hall in Princeton from August 27 through October 8, 1776. Critical decisions regarding the governance of the new state, combined with the imperatives of securing New Jersey's quota of money, arms, provisions, and men for the defense of the United States weighed heavily on each member's mind. On September 15th, the British captured New York, and their ships began shelling Paulus Hook. In this tense atmosphere, it is speculated that the Honorable John Hart, in deference to his duty, rarely bothered to trek the 10 miles home to Hopewell, choosing instead to remain at his post in Princeton with the Assembly. In such a frenzied, businesslike state, it's unlikely that he was aware that his beloved wife had taken ill, and on September 21st had to be treated at home by Dr. Van Kirk, the family physician. Visiting with his wife on Saturday, October 5th, John Hart suddenly fell ill himself, again calling on the services of Dr. Van Kirk. On Monday morning, October 7th, John Hart resumed his place in front of the General Assembly. His attendance in the session, however, was cut short when he was again summoned home. Sometime during that night, Deborah Scudder Hart, at age 55, slipped away from this life. With the family beside her casket, Deborah's body was transported a short 3 miles to the west of Homestead Plantation for interment at Deacon Hunt's burial grounds. Hunt was a neighbor whose spacious flat fields off Rogers Road became the final resting place for many area residents lacking a specific church affiliation. Out of respect for their grieving speaker, the New Jersey State Assembly adjourned on October 8th. With dark clouds looming on all fronts, John Hart spent some time at home to be with his family and mourn in private. By the time the Assembly reconvened in Burlington on November 13th, Continental Army positions in New York were no longer tenable. In quick succession, Fort Washington was captured with a loss of over 3,000 American prisoners, and Fort Lee left abandoned. On the 22nd of November, Washington established temporary headquarters at Newark, only to be forced to relocate to New Brunswick less than a week later. Reeling across New Jersey, the Continental Army was in full retreat when the Assembly adjourned on December 2nd, not knowing when or where they would meet again. The next day, Washington's forces were in Trenton with the British Army under General William Howe in close pursuit. With no time to spare, Washington had every boat available within a 50-mile radius along the Delaware River collected for troop transport. By the 8th of December, the whole of his army had crossed the river to the relative safety of Pennsylvania. That same day, the British Army, with their hired Hessian mercenaries, entered Trenton. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in the time of crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. These were indeed desperate times for the New Jersey leaders of the American Revolution. Danger lurked around every corner, in the darting eyes of strangers and friends met on the street. While it was certainly true the majority of citizens supported independence, not everyone who professed so was fully committed to the cause. Many fell into the summer soldier and sunshine patriot camp, alluded to in Thomas Paine's latest pamphlet, American Crisis, which had begun to circulate in November of 1776. Paine was with the Army as they camped in Pennsylvania, likely writing American Crisis during the retreat through New Jersey. There were also the Loyalists to deal with. These British sympathizers were largely relegated to hold their tongues and keep to themselves during the jubilance of the previous July. Now, with the presence of His Majesty's troops in the surrounding area, they were primed and ready for sweet revenge. With a price on each head, every signer and state government official had reason to fear for his life. Just a week before the British occupied Trenton, word filtered in that Richard Stockton, after helping his family escape, had been captured by a band of Loyalists in Monmouth County. Stockton was paraded off to Perth Amboy, where he was turned over to British authorities. Refusing the protection papers that were being offered by General Howe to anyone willing to renounce the revolutionary movement and swear an oath of allegiance to the king, Stockton was clad in leg irons and trotted off to Provost Prison in New York, where he received cruel and inhumane treatment at the hands of his captors. With Stockton in prison, the British field commander, Lord Charles Cornwallis, took up accommodations in stately Morven Mansion, where he and his troops gleefully helped themselves to the spacious home's amenities as they saw fit. Whether by surreptitious intrigue or calculated misstep, Samuel Tucker, ostensibly the New Jersey State Treasurer, soon found himself ensnared in a similar fix. On December 9, 1776, the day after the enemy entered Trenton, a well-known Tory and female acquaintance of Mr. Tucker's named Mary Poynton led a detachment of British soldiers to the farm of his friend John Abbott. There, without much difficulty, the British were able to locate valuable documents and continental paper money left in Tucker's care. The currency amounted to just under 6,000 pounds of the Western Treasury's allotted 25,000 pounds proclamation money, all in partially signed notes, not having the required 3 signatures that would have made them legal tender. Less than a week later, Samuel Tucker was allegedly beckoned home by his distressed wife. On December 14th, he was promptly captured near Crosswicks Creek at Bordentown with about 1,500 pounds in legal currency on him. The same day, with the beleaguered American troops safely camped on the Pennsylvanian side of the Delaware and believed to be in no condition to resume fighting until spring, General Howe arrogantly gave the order for the British Army to evacuate the Trenton area and return to their winter quarters in New Brunswick. 3 days later, Tucker applied for and received protection papers issued to him by Colonel Johann Rahl, the Hessian commandant left in charge of the garrison remaining at Trenton. From all appearances, it looked like the treasurer and former president of the New Jersey Congress had conveniently switched sides. Upon receiving the shocking news of Stockton's misfortune and Tucker's presumed betrayal, Hart prepared for the worst. With a Hessian outpost stationed in nearby Pennington, where daily foraging sorties were launched into the Hopewell Valley, of utmost concern was the safety of his family, particularly that of his 2 youngest children, 14-year-old Daniel and 12-year-old Deborah. For them, he felt an increased obligation due to their mother's recent passing. The adult children were able to assimilate into the area among relatives and in-laws, along with the rest of his displaced family. It's likely John Hart could have just as easily been welcomed into the households of his lifelong friends, neighbors, and extended family in advance of the enemy. But he, no doubt, did not wish to put any of them in harm's way. But in the early winter of 1776, with Hessians occupying Trenton and growing concerned he may be captured by one of their many patrols, sometime around the 14th of December, the 63-year-old patriarch tore himself away from his family and set off alone to hide among the dense, inhospitable wilderness of the Sourland Mountains. The mountains lay just north of the Hart homestead plantation. One can only imagine what was running through John Hart's mind as he lay there in the mountains day after day, facing the unknown, cold, hungry, and alone. The raw, wintry weather with its chilling dampness biting into his aching, aging bones must have been agony. As he hid in that cave, the new government he worked so hard to create and nurture had been suspended indefinitely. Its leaders dispersed and in hiding, fearing for their very lives. His own family was scattered. His farm, his mills, his horses, his livestock, the accruements of a successful life earned through long and honest labor, had either been seized or possibly laid to waste. He knew not which. John Hart had to wonder what fate awaited him. How long could he survive in the hostile environment he was now forced to call home? How long could he continue to evade the persistent enemy patrols sent out searching for him? Would he, like his fellow cosigner Richard Stockton, be captured and end up wasting away aboard some rat-infested prison ship? By swearing allegiance to the king, he could have his life and home back and see his family again. Maybe he should take the easy way out like Samuel Tucker did while the king's offer for protection was still on the table. He must have felt for his own sons, Jesse and Nathaniel, living on the run, hiding out among their extended families. And surely he must have devoted much serious thought to his son Edward's fate, camped with General Washington across the river. With this depleted army lay all future hope for the lit torch of liberty, however dim and distant it may have appeared in that moment. As is so often the case, the darkest hour is just before the dawn. That is when Providence, or whatever one chooses to believe in, seems to intervene unexpectedly. And that is when the true hero, the one who stood his ground alone against seemingly insurmountable odds, suddenly receives help from the most unlikely of sources, and just in the nick of time. It's probably not too presumptuous, even with the hindsight of 240 years, to say that no one, perhaps not even Washington himself, expected the Continental Army to pull off the miracle at Trenton they did on Christmas night, 1776. Just getting 2,400 ill-clad men, horses, cannon, and equipment across an ice-choked Delaware River in the dead of night during a blinding snowstorm was feat enough for most history books. Then to march the 9 long and arduous miles south from Johnson Ferry to Trenton over unlit, uneven terrain for a pre-dawn surprise attack against the Hessian garrison was a stroke of military genius with a dash of fortuitous luck.
Trenton plays obviously a very important role in the American Revolution. Just outside of town, they're coming in from 2 roads. His army had been split in half at the town of what is now West Trenton. It was known as Birmingham. They split there and approached the town from the north and from the west very closely. They strike the 2 outposts at 8 a.m. They sound the alarm going into town. They completely envelop the town, and the battle is over in a little over an hour. It's a very confused fight in and among the houses and the streets. The Hessians take about 80 or 90 killed and wounded, and remarkably, Washington has no one killed, none that we can find any records of. There's a few that are wounded, a few are succumbed to hypothermia on the way back, but he gathers up the 900 Hessians that he was able to capture. Many more get away. There's about 200 that were south of the Assunpink when the attack happened. They were in manning posts down there. They largely got away. But he captured 900 of these 1,500. He captured their 6 cannons, all their weapons, even their band of music. And immediately packed everything up, went 9 miles north again, and crossed back into Pennsylvania the same way he came.
Their commander-in-chief had his moral victory, which ensured him of the re-enlistment of scores of soldiers whose enlistments were due to expire on January 1st, 1777.
A few days later, Washington decides to recross the Delaware, occupy Trenton. On the 2nd of January, he sends some riflemen, mostly from Pennsylvania and Maryland, up what is now 206 towards Princeton to see what the British are doing. They get about halfway there, and what do they see? It's Cornwallis coming down the road into Trenton. They start fighting a very serious rearguard action, slowly, until they get to Trenton. Washington then sends more regiments forward. Late in the afternoon on January 2nd, there's a much bigger battle going on amongst the streets of Trenton than there was the week before. By late in the afternoon, Washington has his men withdrawn to the south side of the Assunpink, which is a little bit taller than the northern part, so it kind of commands the town. And the British storm the one bridge where Broad Street crosses the Assunpink today. They storm the bridge about 3 times. They're repulsed each time. Then Cornwallis draws his troops off, says, "We'll bag the fox in the morning." Washington meets with his officers, mostly with his generals and a few colonels, as he's trying to decide what to do. He does not want to stay on the south side of the Assunpink. South Jersey is like a cul-de-sac for him. He'll get trapped there. The further south he goes, the wider the Delaware is. It's going to be very hard for him to get away. Officers come in, tell him that it's now freezing again, and the back road, a back way into Princeton, that this road is now frozen. It can be passed, and he decides, well, we're going to go around the British and fall on their rear guard in Princeton. They wrap the cannon wheels with rags and so on to muffle them. He leaves some of the local militia behind here. It says, build up the fires, make it sound like you're entrenching and so on, and after a while, just disappear. He takes his army up what would be Hamilton Avenue, roughly, to Quaker Bridge Road, comes in the back way to Princeton, and just about where the Quaker Meeting House would be, he finds the rear guard, which is just pulling out of town. They start a meeting engagement, two sides that run into each other without planning. And that develops on the 3rd of January into the famous Battle of Princeton. He's faced by 3 British regiments and a few other stragglers. It's very back and forth for about an hour, hour and a half, in open field fighting. Eventually they start to collapse and they start to fall back towards Princeton proper. One of the regiments takes refuge in Nassau Hall. Supposedly, Alexander Hamilton fires a few rounds through the walls and they decide to finally surrender.
The battles of Trenton and Princeton ended the 1776 campaign. Licking his wounds, Cornwallis rounded up his men and headed back to New Brunswick, effectively leaving central New Jersey devoid of the enemy's presence. Meanwhile, Washington hustled his men onto winter quarters in Morristown. After 2 weeks in self-imposed exile and untold deprivation, John Hart was finally able to come out of hiding. He rejoined his family and returned to his farm, which he found surprisingly intact. Unshaken in his resolve, Hart also returned to his duties as Speaker, promptly reconvening the Assembly in order to assess the damage done during the occupation and get the government rolling again. Safety was still a concern in and around Trenton. Haddonfield seemed to be more suitable. The legislature stayed in session there from January 29th until March 18th. Even though the legislature was able to reconvene in Haddonfield with most of the members returning, several key individuals were conspicuously absent from the proceedings. Most notable were Richard Stockton and Samuel Tucker, but for different reasons. At the urging of Congress, George Washington was asked to intervene on Stockton's behalf. Negotiating with British authorities, Washington was successful in gaining Stockton's release, but not before Stockton spent 5 torturous weeks aboard a British prison ship, and the price for Stockton's parole was steep. Although he did not have to pledge allegiance to the king for protection papers, as Tucker and others chose to do, Stockton was required to sign a document effectively removing himself from any further service in the Continental Congress or New Jersey state government. Demoralized, Judge Stockton returned to Morven in ill health, never again to play a major role in the politics of his state or country. As for Samuel Tucker, Governor Livingston levied a verdict on him and all members of the legislature who signed the king's protection papers, barring them from resuming their official positions.
Tucker never expresses his opinions about the revolution in any strong way. Did what he would need to do as a leader of the protest and then the independence movement. Hart, on the other hand, was much more precise about his feelings. He was a very strong supporter of the revolution. I think it goes without saying that for him to be a signer of the Declaration of Independence, not just one who went along with it, speaks volumes. The fact that he was chosen as a representative to go and do that speaks volumes of how people understood his feelings about the movement. The suffering that he had to go through after signing the Declaration speaks to his commitment and his family's commitment. Tucker certainly had his moments when he did not seem to display the same degree of commitment to the cause. He was not, however, a loyalist, but it did diminish his reputation as being really committed to the cause. And that cost him. I think it does show some weakness. It shows maybe that he wasn't willing to stand up as much as other people like John Hart were. It may have been just a bad decision that he made. I think when you compare Tucker and Hart, you definitely see someone in Hart who was totally committed to the cause. I think you see somebody committed to the cause with Tucker also, but maybe not as strong-willed a person about it or as deeply thoughtful about it as Hart was.
With his resolve renewed following his ordeal in the Sourlands, John Hart resumed his duties seemingly as if nothing had happened to him. From 1777 to 1778, the Assembly met in session 10 times, totaling 270 days. John Hart was twice re-elected Speaker during that time. In 1778, he was also elected to the Council of Safety. This council was given extraordinary and summary powers to conduct the most urgent affairs of the state. In a rather fitting twist of fate, he also became president of joint meetings of the New Jersey Congress, replacing his old friend and rival Samuel Tucker. His priorities and loyalties were firm, his conviction unshakable. And they had surely been put to the test in the Sourlands. He had pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. Nothing was more important to him. On June 22, 1778, when word had reached Washington at Valley Forge that a British force had left Philadelphia seeking action in New Jersey, Jesse and Nathaniel Hart, serving as scouts at their father's request, led George Washington's Continental Army to their Hopewell farm to camp. While there, John Hart entertained His Excellency, sharing a midday meal with him and some senior officers. It would be the last time the two men would see each other. Although the farm, like its owner, was but a vestige of its former glory, whatever was available was put at the general's disposal. All was given from the heart without hesitation or reservation. When the Continental Army of 12,000 decamped to engage the enemy at Monmouth, they left the plantation fields trampled, the summer crops depleted, and fence rails and ash heaps. But unlike his neighbors who likewise quartered some of the troops, John Hart never put in a claim for payment with the Continental Congress. Soon after Washington's encampment at Hopewell, John Hart retired from public life. He knew his time was drawing near. The intense pain radiating from his lower abdomen around to the small of his back was getting worse. There was little he could do to find comfort, but certainly traveling any distance by carriage or on horseback was out of the question. He was ready to let other younger lions carry on the public service he had devoted nearly 3 decades of his life to. Beginning in 1750, with his election as freeholder, then as Justice of the Peace, Common Pleas Judge, Assemblyman, Committeeman, Chairman, Delegate, Representative, Signer of the Declaration of Independence, and of course, Mr. Speaker, it was by all accounts not a bad resume for an uneducated farmer from Hopewell. John Hart died at his home on May 11, 1779. In the May 19th edition of the New Jersey Gazette, a more fitting obituary could not have been written for a gentleman who prided himself simply by being himself and acting on behalf of the interests of the common man. It read as follows: On Tuesday, the 11th instant, departed this life at his seat in Hopewell, John Hart, Esquire, the Representative in General Assembly for the County of Hunterdon, and late Speaker of that House. He had served in the Assembly for many years under the former government, taken an early and active part in the present revolution, and continued to the day he was seized with his last illness to discharge the duties of a faithful and upright patriot in the service of his country in general and the county he represented in particular. The universal approbation of his character and conduct among all ranks of people is the best testimony of his worth, and as it must make his death regretted and lamented will ensure lasting respect to his memory. Even with John Hart's lifelong principled approach to money, lending, spending, and borrowing, he could not have foreseen the avalanche of debt caused by the perfect storm of events that descended upon his estate after he passed on, leaving his sons with little choice but to sell off everything and start over elsewhere. Depreciation of the dollar, devaluation of the land, inflation of the costs for goods and services, and an unending war had a catastrophic effect on the Hart legacy. By 1790, his sons had sold all of John Hart's considerable accumulated assets. Properties and real estate once exceeding 600 acres went to pay off creditors and tax assessors or to settle petty disputes among themselves, all in the name of their father's lifetime of generosity. It's often said that the leaders of the American Revolution had the most to lose. Still, they were willing to risk it all for the cause of liberty. That was certainly true for John Hart, as it was for George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and many others who owned large estates and had their values deeply rooted in the English colonial way of life.
Well, I think that every man was his own man. Hart certainly, because of his age, his maturity, when he was in a room, people knew he was there, not because of being demonstrative, but they understood the presence. Very much like a George Washington, who was a very quiet person socially, but yet everybody, he immediately had everybody's respect. And I have a feeling that John Hart was that kind of person. He was Mr. Everyman in many ways. He was a man who was universally looked up to. Even though he didn't have some of the personal experiences in his background that some of the other founding fathers did. He was just a man who had the talent and the integrity and everything that people were looking for to be a leader. I think if John Hart had been a younger man, we talked about his maturity, I think it was also a problem for him in history. He was too old to be involved with both the Declaration and the Constitution to be up there with that, like you say, the guys up on the pedestal and everything. I think it would be very interesting if he had been in his 30s or 40s instead of his 60s during the Revolution.
Unlike Washington, Jefferson, and many other founding fathers, Hart was not bred to be a leader. He was not a man of letters. Nor was he educated to run a business or trained to govern men. But he made himself so. What makes John Hart's life so memorable and his contributions to the country so remarkable as to be worthy of study and personal reflection is that John Hart was simply a common man who, because of his irrefutable integrity, was called upon by his peers during a time of inconceivable crisis to speak for them, to fight for them, and, when necessary, to lead them. Although hidden from us by history, his is the face of the everyman who rises from humble beginnings and soars to extraordinary heights quietly, honestly, and without need for material reward. Perhaps that is why it is so hard for us to picture him, and yet why we must. John Hart is the face of every one of us.